What a pleasure and honor and also a challenge to follow on such an ambush and a series of, let's say, very forceful interventions and reminders. And luckily, we have now time with a unique panel. And as Tom said, my name is Martin Breum. I'm a journalist. I'm from Copenhagen. I cover the Arctic for a number of media, and I have done so for a number of years. And I feel very privileged that I've been asked to moderate a conversation, first of all, between the four people here. I will introduce them to you in a while. And then afterwards, we've given also the opportunity now to have a conversation with you. So as we go along here, I urge you to take notes, write down your questions, your comments, your state of mind, really, because this is a unique chance to kickstart this Congress with a conversation with a fairly unique group of people. And let me tell you who are here. The furthest from me, Mr. Vladimir Katsov is a member of the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program, and Vladimir is based in St. Petersburg on a daily basis. He's also the director, and I want you to listen closely because it's rather important. You're all very important, of course. We're all very important here, as the President just said, and the Ambassador. But I think it's worth noting, so I'll spend a little time telling you exactly who these people are. Vladimir is also the director of the oldest Russian meteorological research institution. It's named the Voyakov Main Geophysical Observatory in St. Petersburg. That was founded way back in 1849. He's the lead author of a number of climate assessments for the IPCC and for EMAP, and many more things, but basically an expert in global and regional climate modeling with a particular attention to the Arctic. You all know better than me how important the climate, of course, is to the stresses on biodiversity here. Mike Gill, many of you know already from Canada, and the former chair of CAF's Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, I believe until 2013. Now the director of Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe. That's a group of concerned scientists trying to keep a finger on the pulse of the globe. And Mike is head of their sort of global program. So really somebody who's now bringing not only the Arctic knowledge, but the whole world to us, basically. Mike also holds an elected position as co-chair of the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. I'm sure all of you know what that is. Also honorary fellow at the UN Environment's World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge in the UK. Gunn-Britt, as you can tell, is a Sami. She's from the Sami Council in Norway. Gunn-Britt is a coastal Sami from northeastern Norway, a place called Unjarka Neseby. She's worked with Arctic environment issues for the last 17 years, first at the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, that was based in Denmark. That's the one that's now moved to Tromsø. And since 2005, that's a while, in her present position as head of the Arctic and Environmental Unit of the Sami Council, one of the 6 groups, of course, associated permanent participants to the Arctic Council. So, Tasha is here, as you may have noticed, as a young person. They're sometimes taking as, you know, they bring in 1 or 2, and then they say, well, we're all good. And this time around, it's true. Tasha Elisarde is an Arctic Youth Ambassador of note, born and raised in Juneau in Alaska, the capital of Alaska, of course, managed this summer the Alaska Youth for Environmental Action Summer Youth Salmon Fellowship Program, and involved in many different ways in politics and storytelling in Alaska. She worked for a while, believe it or not, for Lisa Murkowski, the famous senator of Alaska, and is currently studying economics, public policy, communications, and cognitive science. Sorry for taking such a long time, but I think it's important to know in front of this discussion who we are with. And we are, of course, to talk about all the things of importance here, and of course that's really impossible. So rising temperatures, melting ice, thawing, permafrost, habitat disturbance, pollution, invasive alien species, and acidifying oceans. That's what we're about to cover. And I think that was the brief we were given, basically. And what are the real implications? Do we realize do we know what we don't know? Where are the knowledge gaps? How do we prioritize, and what are we to do? How are we making it happen? Who are responsible? And how should we advance what others should do? That's really what they have been asking us to do. And that, of course, is an impossibility. And yet, this is what we will achieve. Amazing or not. It is. And I think, Tasha, it's only reasonable that we start off with you and simply ask you, as a representative of the generation that will have to live with the decisions we make or not make at this juncture in time, what does climate change and the challenge it poses mean to you?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. I was born and raised in Juneau, Alaska, which is, like you said, the capital of the state, and therefore the capital of the portion of the Arctic of the United States of America. And in Juneau, I live 15 minutes away from Mendenhall Glacier, which since my birth, since I was born and raised there, has been receding in the past few years. So I remember when I was young, maybe like 7 years old or so, I would be able to hike up to the scenic point where I would be able to see the Mendenhall Glacier with my family. And now that I am 19 years old, once I reach the top of that same scenic point, I'm not able to see the glacier anymore. And that, to me, is a strident reminder that climate change is real. It is happening. But at the same time, I have friends through the Arctic Youth Ambassador Program, as well as just anywhere from across the state, who are being impacted by climate change in a variety of different ways, and not just because they're viewing the glacier as an aesthetic. Through the Ambassador Program, there's one ambassador who is from Shishmaref, whose community is unfortunately being set for relocation because of the harmful effects of erosion. Another ambassador who unfortunately couldn't make this trip is from Utqiagvik, and the whaling hunt is being impacted because of the change in biodiversity there. And so his traditional values, his traditions are being impacted by the changes in the environment. And so it all goes back to, like you said, the decisions that we choose to make or not make today are going to impact the youth. And I think that's really important to consider, especially given the fact that unfortunately, youth aren't always given the position to be able to speak on issues like this, not formally, or make the formal decisions ourselves. And so I really pressure everyone in this audience to understand and hear the voices of the young people, both myself, but also the people who are in attendance at this conference, and the group here today who I believe will be floating around the city today for the Arctic Youth Summit that I'm participating in, and hear the stories that we are hoping to share.
Thanks very much, Tasha. And no, we have to go on, but I will return to this. Mike, if we take into account, or I want you to take into account, of course, you were one of the fathers, so to speak, of the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment back a few years back in 2014. There was the action plan. There's now been assessments. We have the Aichi goals. There are hundreds of documents that you can dive into if you want to know something about biodiversity in the Arctic nowadays, and more coming up, luckily. There are the conventions. But if you try for a moment to cut through all that in one go and try to help us get to the core at this, let's say, starting point of the Congress, how would you define the main problem that Arctic diversity is faced with right now?
Well, that's a tough one.
I'll just do it briefly.
Well, I would say I would say from my perspective anyways, living in the Arctic for 18 years, but now operating outside of it, one of the unique features of the Arctic is that most of the main drivers of biodiversity change and loss are external to the Arctic. And they're happening at large scales that really drove the reason why we developed the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, that need to coordinate across scales to really aggregate data, work with Indigenous people to really understand what's happening on the ground, and be able to actually get into a position to predict. With climate change being the one that was the top stressor recognized in the ABA and the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, I think the big challenge that we face now is how do we go from the traditional sort of static spatial depictions of climate change. It's the Arctic's going to warm by this much. This is how we'll see it change. But really what's important is the increased variability. So we're already seeing more icing events. How do we actually detect and understand extreme events? About 10 years or so ago in northern Sweden, in a course of a 3-week period, the birch forests were defoliated by a moth, which fundamentally actually reboots that ecosystem, changes it. So how do we actually take the scientific knowledge and understanding and actually localize it? So how do we shift more towards a proactive science and cultural-based approach around adaptation? So how do we equip and work with local peoples to actually manage, predict, and proactively address the issues around biodiversity conservation at local and watershed scales? To me, that's a cross-cutting issue to focus on.
And now, since you're the friend of all the people here, they can take it. So please help me understand. You're talking of the growth in variability and the need to localize the new knowledge that is produced. To what degree is this scientific community armed to do that?
Well, I would say they're very armed. At the last Congress, which was the last time I came to an Arctic event, the executive secretary of the CBD said, of the one region in the world that actually can meet the ACHI targets, it's this one. And I don't think he was just saying that. He was saying that because there's a lot of strengths to this community of people. We have intact, functioning ecosystems with people that actually live traditional lifestyles and hold that multi-generational knowledge. We have room to maneuver. We have an Arctic Council. We have a group under CAF that's actually organizing themselves around biodiversity monitoring and actions for biodiversity. So the foundations are very much in place to actually do this. And I think the Arctic, it's not perfect, but we do have a long tradition of working with scientists and local peoples to actually implement a co-managed, co-development, and community-based monitoring to address some of those issues. So we have all the ingredients, but I think the trick now is to actually make some tough choices about what we should focus on and where we should go.
I'm happy you're so optimistic and let's say promising in the way you address this. I sat next to somebody over breakfast this morning at the hotel, and I asked him, how's the monitoring program going? And he said, monitoring? That's a big word. Meaning there are still very many gaps in the instruments that is to provide the information we need or the science that we need to do all what is required. But let's return to the knowledge gaps in a minute then, because sure. I would like to jump to you, Vladimir Katsov, as a modeling and as an expert in climate change. You know better than most, and as Mike said, it's a long time ago that climate change was identified as the main challenge to biodiversity in the Arctic. It sort of exacerbates all the other stressors. So coming from the world of climate science, can you tell us to what degree do we know how the climate is developing in the Arctic?
I should say that there are really questions which I think have already received sufficient responses. I think that we can state, maybe I start not from the Arctic, but in a minute I'll be there. We can state first that the global warming, observed global warming, is unequivocal. It's the IPCC terminology. We know that the chemical composition of the atmosphere is changing very quickly and dramatically. Now we have something like 409 ppm of CO2, the main driver of the global warming in the atmosphere. It's, we used to say every year it's unprecedented. This is true. It's unprecedented if compared against past 800,000 years, which are available for us from some reconstructions of ice cores, for example. We can be sure that this is one of main causes of the observed warming. And we can say that humankind is responsible for this to a great extent. Some common places. Now to the Arctic. As it has been already said, Arctic is warming quicker than the rest of the world. Well, it's going to warm fast in the future. You just simply multiply the global warming by 2 or 2.5, depending on the region you call the Arctic, and you have the result. Yeah, again, it's one of the most vulnerable regions of the world. An interesting feature of the Arctic is that it may have a number of serious feedbacks to the global climate through sea level rise, for example, through thermohaline circulation in the ocean. And again, another common place is it's really difficult to observe, to model, because of complexity of physical processes there and other processes, biogeochemical, for example, and also to predict. Having said all that, I should stress that with this, the climate science is not settled at all. Because this knowledge is enough to take important decisions, like Paris Agreement, I would say, like other important decisions. But when we come to details at national, subnational, local levels and everything, we really are faced with a number of very serious knowledge gaps, which we really need to urgently deal with somehow. And I can comment on this, but maybe a bit later.
No, I think that's very pertinent, because as Mike said, one of the challenges now is probably to address the heightened speed of variability and say, how do we then, also with the lack of knowledge of climate change on a localized level, how on earth do we make that happen? How do we localize our knowledge if we cannot predict the climate in the area we are working in the geographical area that we're looking at?
There is, of course, a very evident progress in many aspects of monitoring, also of modeling of climate system and Arctic climate system in particular. We are really equipped now with very strong tools, and we are actually using a dramatic part of the world's computing resources for these reasons. This is a pretty powerful set of instruments. And having all these instruments, we also need to know how to use what we obtain with them. And this is another very important part of science, which really has a lot of gaps.
Lots of gaps. Thank you for identifying one of those. That's one of our tasks here is to start identifying the gaps, of course, so that people can start sort of filling in the gaps. One other question. Now we've heard of the report from Korea just on Sunday. Can you tell us, even if on a global level we're successful, let's be optimistic, to keep global warming within the 1.5? What would that mean in the Arctic?
Yeah. It's a good question. Actually, to be honest, I haven't had time to read the
Who has?
big book. I even only very superficially ran through the summary, and my absolutely personal impression is that it many times compares the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, and how significant this difference is. And I should say that I can conclude that, from what I already have said, that this difference is greater for the Arctic, just because of this is the fastest warming region in the world. So when we speak about differences, the difference should be evident here, and this is important. Also, I would touch another aspect which I suppose is not covered in this report, but maybe I'm wrong, just because I don't know. There is a strong feeling that Arctic is not going to stop its changing, even if stabilization globally is achieved. In many aspects, for example, its cryospheric part, it's not going to stop losing mass in Greenland, for example, and glaciers. Well, I probably should stop at this point because there are many interesting continuations of what we observe now, even if the temperature globally is somewhat stabilized.
Surely, thank you very much. Talking, Gunbright, of sort of baselines here, to what degree are we on track when it comes to the incorporation, the mainstreaming, whatever we call it, of the rights and needs of indigenous peoples in the Arctic when we talk about safeguarding biodiversity conservation and these types of actions? I mean, we heard a very forceful intervention here from some of your Sami colleagues from the ICC. There are still very many people who talk of it as if there is a problem. Even if it's embedded in the CBD, it's embedded in the new High Seas Agreement, it's embedded in every single document you can think of within the last 20 years. It says, don't forget the indigenous people, remember their indigenous knowledge, it's very, very important for everything. Does it work?
Yeah, well, we remember to write it in documents.
Yeah.
Well, I think you introduced this session that people should take notes while we are discussing, and I hope people took notes also during the keynote speeches, because I think they were a wonderful opening, and I'm happy that the organizers have involved 2 solid speakers already of indigenous issues already in the opening, and actually on the panel being the 3rd already. So yeah, I think on the international level or global level, the inclusion of references to indigenous knowledge and indigenous peoples is quite high level and sufficient and due to tireless lobbying of indigenous peoples. And because I think it's of imperative importance that indigenous peoples are part of the decision making when it comes to making actions for the future. And but also what my friends here in the panel already identified, the gaps are at the local and regional level. And I think that goes for participation as well. And I experience that, well, you might say that the Arctic Council is a regional body, but if you also, and the indigenous participation is relatively solid here. But if you think of regions, for example, in Norway or at the local municipal level, I think there is gaps in actually recognizing indigenous people's rights and actually having enough participation in the decision making. But that is on the and another aspect here is the indigenous knowledge thing, which is very important that in the decision making, that you need to make the decisions on the best available knowledge, and that is both science and indigenous knowledge, as Daly already referred to. So, but that also implies participation. One is a decision making, but also in the science and the development of the knowledge basis, we need solid participation there too. And that is well written into text, but I think we are still struggling in actually doing it on the ground, and we need to strengthen institutions and indigenous societies to actually be able to take on all the invitations we have for participation.
I want to bring in Tasha in a minute, but Mike, could you say a few words about indigenous knowledge and how, or the degree to which the science community has been able to incorporate all the aspects of traditional knowledge. We've had two very eloquent speakers here telling us just how wide-ranging traditional knowledge is in their perception. Does that match with the look on traditional knowledge within the science community?
Well, that's a tricky one. I would say we're not there yet. I think we're moving in the right direction. There's lots of great examples of local projects that are, that have been going on a long time, like the Fisheries Joint Management Committee in the Beaufort Sea region of Canada. That's a great partnership between scientists and local experts working together to understand and manage marine species in that area, coastal species. But I think there is still, and we heard it in the last speaker, that there's still, I think, I don't know if the scientific community has quite got there in terms of, we still often talk about conserving ecosystems from the standpoint of things other than humans, right? And but I think that dialogue is starting to change, and I think when we get there, then we really end up in a powerful point where we can actually work truly together at local scales. And I think when I look at the actions for biodiversity 2017 to 2021 or whatever, there's sort of a long list there, which is totally realistic. You've got to have that list, but we have to make some prioritizations on that list. What's the most important thing? And to me, I think it really is getting at the question about how do some of these global forcings, such as climate change, but that's only one of them. I mean, there's invasive species, others. How do we actually sort of work together at local community levels? That's where the best conservation success stories are, and that's where I think we should go with this. So I don't know if it quite answers the question, but
it does.
We can get there.
I think it does, and thank you for that. I also know that there is work, very structured work within the CAF community, of course, to sort of bring traditional knowledge and the science together in a systematic fashion, the co-production of knowledge and so forth. And Tasha, talking about that, to what degree do you experience back in a capital city that traditional knowledge actually plays a role?
Sure, in the decision-making process or gathering science, anything.
You live in a big city, you in Juneau, in Alaska. To what degree is traditional knowledge? It's a big city, come on.
We are the third largest city in the state, which isn't saying much because we have 35,000 people, and the next largest is also 35,000 people.
Yeah.
But
well, it's twice as big as the capital of Greenland. Come on.
it's fair.
Anyway, my point is, to what degree do you experience that traditional knowledge plays a role, that it is recognized, that it's there and present?
I think that's a really great question, and I have to rewind because I need to recognize the fact that I do live in one of the urban communities in Alaska, and therefore I think what we're addressing here when it comes to indigenous knowledge, especially in the realms of climate change too, a lot of the gaps that we mostly see are happening in communities that are more rural. And there have been more partnerships going on and forward. Attending a last conference that I, as well as a few other Arctic Youth Ambassadors, had gone to, there was a lot of discussion about the LEO network, which is sort of like this network and ability, this app that you can use to take photos of different examples of climate change that are happening in different communities as a way to streamline that information to larger bodies, and that's used by the government to the federal and state government. And also, there has been, at least in the current gubernatorial administration in Alaska, we're working together to have, we had a climate action leadership team, which involved several leaders from the Alaska Native community. But that being said, if we're talking specifically about making sure that we have these partnerships with local communities, I don't think it's there yet. Frankly, whenever I have conversations with other ambassadors, I mentioned earlier how we have an ambassador who is from Shishmaref, the community that is suffering from erosion and set to relocate in the next few years. We were talking earlier about, and he had brought up how now we could see orcas from his community coming up, even though in years past that wasn't something that is normal, and that's changing the biodiversity in the area. And those things are not being directly addressed from his standpoint and from other people's standpoint. And the same thing rings true for a lot of those other communities in Alaska. And so what I can say is that there are still a lot of gaps. I unfortunately couldn't offer solutions at this point, which is what I feel like this conversation should be talking more about, is how we approach those problems. But I can say that there are a lot of existing gaps in our state.
And talking of gaps, I mean, this is a crucial issue for this Congress. So excuse me if I sort of stay a little on this topic of knowledge gaps. How do we, Mr. Katzoff, how do we know, because I mean, science exists on the existence of knowledge gaps, obviously. So they're all experts here in looking for knowledge gaps. So how do we know which knowledge gaps are the important ones? How do we prioritize, because we can identify 1,000 knowledge gaps in half an hour within this room? Which are the really, really important ones?
Let me start with just an illustration or example. You mentioned when introducing me that I'm a part of what is called World Climate Research Program. This is really a very big community. It's a global one. It operates under the umbrella of World Meteorological Organization and two other very important co-sponsors, just for information. It was something like 7 years ago, I guess, when the World Climate Research Program asked itself at its big open conference, what are really most important, how would you say it, bottlenecks in science, preventing us from getting to the answers in very important questions concerning physical climate. It's not about everything, it's not about biodiversity, but in this respect. And that was a big discussion across the whole community. And the program came up with something like 7 plus minus so-called grand challenges. This language is used everywhere around, but I think that time it was somewhat new. And those grand challenges preventing us from important progress in important directions of science. They were formulated, and one of them, I'm not going to describe all this picture, but one of them was very critically associated with high latitudes, and particularly cryosphere and cryospheric process and that kind of things. And indeed, when we are talking about this global warming and climate change things, we really are missing a very crucial thing, which is quantification of the processes. And for example, we are talking about the shrinking of sea ice in the Arctic. By the way, today we know that its seasonal minimum is decreasing by 12.8% per decade. This morning I got this information from the National Center, United States National Center on Sea Ice and Snow. It's actually getting less sharp than it was, for example, by 2012, the absolute minimum over the observation period. So we know it's going to become more or less seasonal in the Arctic, and the very important question is how soon. And there is a big room for all kinds of speculations, and is it going to happen within the next couple of decades or after, or the beginning of the second half of the 21st century? This 10 to 20 to 30 years is very important information we need about it. The other one, also associated with cryosphere and with the Arctic, is permafrost, and its potential to be involved in feedback with chemical composition of the atmosphere through emissions of carbon, natural emissions, which can be switched off at some point, maybe already switched off, and add non-anthropogenic carbon to this to the content of carbon in the atmosphere. This, at some point, theoretically, might become comparable to anthropogenic one, and we can hardly do anything about it. So it's a big uncertainty there, and scientists are ranging in their opinions about it from very skeptic to alarmist.
Exactly.
And a big number of questions about it. Also, other things like already mentioned freshwater issue with North Atlantic, the freshwater coming from the Arctic and influencing this way the global thermohaline circulation, which is actually the weather in Europe, for example, or the impact of shrinking ice for high-impact weather in mid-latitudes, and predictability of the Arctic climate itself. Let me remind you that it has highly vigorous unforced variability, natural variability, which is a big problem, among others. So here is the list. Quantification of many of these things is crucial for our understanding, for our behavior, for our adaptation and mitigation efforts in the nearest future, right now, later on. So this is one of important gaps. But of course, there are other beyond the Arctic.
Thank you very much. Mike, Jill, how do we know what knowledge gaps are the most important?
Well, from my standpoint, I mean, you said I was optimistic, and I guess I flawed in that way. But at the same time, there is, as Vladimir's already said, there's undeniable change underway and will continue and accelerate. So based on that tight situation that we find ourselves in, we have to make some priority decisions. And I think scientists sometimes, they focus on perfection, which of course is the enemy of the good. So what would be the priority knowledge gaps for me? Those are the ones that allow us to take some actual real action. It might not be perfect. We can learn from our mistakes. That's the criteria, the approach to take. So there's a number that have already been mentioned in terms of understanding that variability, tipping points and things like that. But I've got others.
But that, of course, is really important, because if we are looking at accelerating climate change, if we're looking at accelerating variability, if we are looking for a greater need for quicker localization of knowledge and thereby decision making, are we also therefore needy of we need to identify knowledge gaps that can be filled within a reasonable time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I looked at the themes to this Congress, and one of them is safeguarding important areas or something like that. And there's some great work underway that I think underpins some good decisions that we can make. So there's actually someone in the room that's just been recently funded by NASA to quantify and spatially depict and map ecosystem function diversity, which sounds super nerdy, but is actually a really important aspect for us to identify those areas that we should safeguard. So focusing on the science of resilience and adaptation is crucially important, and we should focus a lot of our science around that.
And that of course is really pointing for those who design science programs, of course, that they need time frames, they need localization. I can feel that you want to say something. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have very strong feelings. Yeah, but don't we know enough already to take action? So, or isn't it other gaps serious enough to avoid to take action? And at global level, I think we have enough. Like Vladimir said, we have enough knowledge to take action. We can't avoid taking action, like Tina also said earlier. But also, what was triggering for me is that the knowledge gaps might be on the more of the regional and local levels. And do we know enough to make decisions at the local level and regional levels? And that might be a gap. And as I said in my first intervention, I think also another gap is, and I'm glad to see that like a congress like this it's important that there is a lot of indigenous participation here, because I think a congress like this can be a mechanism to prioritize among those gaps, because everybody have their favorite gap. But when we gather so much clever people and competence in a room, and that's probably what CAF hopes to get out of it, is to identify what are the most important gaps that we need to take action on. So that's why it's important there's a lot of indigenous peoples here also to identify what are the gaps from our perspectives. And I think, and when I have been thinking around this in the past, I end up with, and this is a message in particular to Finland, Norway, Sweden, which I know best, that if we want to fill the gap on the indigenous knowledge, we need to also invest in the Sami institutions so we can organize this indigenous participation, because we can't just trust individuals from, I wouldn't say from the streets, but from the paths by who you accidentally a scientist meet, that is the one who contributes the knowledge. They need to have backup from some institutions. So we need to be very conscious about building these institutions so the indigenous knowledge holders can have a solid participation at local and also global level.
And that, Taisha, go ahead.
Sure, I really wanted to respond to that, because I think this is a big conversation that we always have, especially, I mentioned earlier how I'm participating in the Arctic Youth Summit. So basically there are this amazing group of youth around the Arctic who are gathering here in Finland this week to talk about the different concerns that we have as youth about the Arctic. And one of the issues that had come up as a recurring theme is the issue of self-determination. And this idea that these local communities, they know what's best. And so frankly, if we want to know what knowledge gaps exist, we should just go out and ask those communities. Because what knowledge lies best, what knowledge is there that we need is going to be found with the people who live there. And we're working more on that in Alaska by going out and really trying to develop those relationships between the state government and the local governments as well as local people there. But there's always more room for improvement and ways that we can continue having that communication. So, and I also kind of want to do a little plug-in too about the Arctic Youth Summit, just because I mentioned how we are talking about all these issues that are impacting youth. I think there's a variety of different communities that within the Arctic, the indigenous community, the people who are younger folks who have a different set of issues that impact them. But I think that when we all bridge that together, there are going to be recurring themes. We were looking at the concerns that we had listed out, and they're very similar to the one that the Arctic Council has already listed. So just also wanted to bring that in. I think there may be gaps, but there are a lot more connections than I think that people are recognizing.
Thanks. And you said something interesting that I think resonates very much with what the two scientists here said, that there is lots of people out there ready to act, and they have knowledge of their local problems. So now the connection. There is a lot of people here who are concerned with outreach, with mainstreaming. Some of the recommendations back from the ABA were exactly on those issues. So before I open the floor, which I do in a few minutes, let's talk just a tiny bit about that. The president said we need your voice, very nicely so. But he also said in some capitals, climate change may not be the best conversation starter these days. Some of the Arctic capitals. I was in Arkhangelsk in Russia, I think last year in March, and had the pleasure of listening into a conversation on a stage like this between the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and I believe the Finnish president was there and others. And President Putin expressed some, let's say, skepticism towards sort of the mainstream thinking on the impact of man on climate. He was talking of solar cycles, etc. And then, of course, famously, the president on the other side of the Atlantic chose to draw the Americas, or the American state, the USA, out of the Paris Accords. So we have the president's word and these statements that tell us, well, at the highest level, there's still work to be done. Now, if we talk on local level, regional level, to what extent is science meeting local communities at this stage? Katsov.
Let me start with president level.
Fair enough.
Actually, it is quite naturally that you are arriving at this point, because we already, well, I'm starting to hate this word, gap, but I have to use it. It's not only about knowledge gaps, it's also about gaps or insufficiency in communication and interpretation. We have a chain starting from us. You're probably the next part of the chain. I mean, if I understand correctly this, it's a classical example between Working Group 1 of IPCC, which deals with big climate science, beautiful models, all this luxury of analysis, of monitoring and everything. Then there is a Working Group 2, which deals with impacts, adaptation, and other very, very important and much more practical issues. And we still don't have a good bridge between these groups in terms of communicating of results of Working Group 1, results of models, for example, to those who are using them in their impact models. Interpretation of these very complicated things is a big issue, and it deserves a lot of efforts. But impact and adaptation research community is not the final in the chain. The final one probably is the president. He's a part of the chain, and he also needs some communication and interpretation. It's not a trivial issue. For example, it's a big deal to explain to anyone how the climate system works with all these external forcings, part of them anthropogenic, part of them natural. It's unforced variability, which is masking all these external forcings. The uncertainty regarding the future of, for example, anthropogenic forcings. Both, actually. We don't know how volcanoes are going to explode and that kind of things, and about solar activity. So it's just unpredictable at the moment, and I don't believe we are going to have a tremendous progress in the next decades or so with this. I don't think it's possible. Well, actually, there are boundaries. We cannot go beyond, because we have to be modest in some things. We are never going to have a prediction of weather forecast beyond, say, theoretically a couple of weeks. It's just not possible for some reasons. But we can do something about this. We can quantify uncertainty, we can explain this, and we can help to take right decisions. And we are not excellent with this at the moment, with this climate change story.
Mike, how do we then get better? You know better than most here that mainstreaming into many sectors of society takes hard work every single day by people who devote time for that. The outreach to large groups of society takes a hell of a lot of efforts. And we're still not there. We're not interpreting, apparently, things in a way where impact is achieved to the degree we would like. what to do?
Well, you said earlier, to what extent are scientists meeting local needs, but I sort of see it more as a two-way street. I think, I was lucky enough to spend 18 years in the North, and I learned a lot just by working at the local level. It was very much not just me going out there and not even close and telling people, this is the way things are and how they were, but it was really more of a collective understanding and communication, and through that you get that language and you get to start to speak everyone's language. So it's almost like a cultural exercise. And I think around the whole idea of mainstreaming, it's not just that we can do a better job at the local level and partnering. And people in this room are really good at this, at least now that I work in other parts of the world. The Arctic is really, in a way, sadly, a leader on this, in that it's too bad that it's not better elsewhere. But there's a lot we can actually learn from the rest of the world. So I think the Arctic is so well organized, at least in my viewpoint, that sometimes we're a victim of our own success. And so we're not always, we're saying we can do this, we'll come up with our own innovations and our own solutions, when there's actually other people out there that are solving problems that we can actually simply grab. And we need to connect more to that global community around modeling, around indicators, around data visualization, data management, and mainstreaming. The World Conservation Monitoring Center is leading on a really cool mainstream project in Africa, which, okay, it's Africa, it's not the Arctic, but I think there's some lessons learned that can easily be translated to this part of the world. So we really got to keep our radar on to harvest some of those innovations.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Gunbritt to say something, but then the floor is open. So in a minute, you just raise your hand and the microphones will find their ways. But I wanted to ask you a question. I know you want to say something, but I want to ask you a question also. Because sometimes Indigenous peoples are also very protective of their ways of life, even if this life endangers local nature, species, fish, whatever. How would we go about it if we wanted the Indigenous people to take, let's say, action on conservation in a different way?
I don't know if I agree with the starting point of your
No, I know you
question.
don't. But I know it's true.
Yeah, well, sometimes it might be, well, of course it's always a very complex issue, and you can, but in general rule, I think the Indigenous use of resources is mostly sustainable, and you have, like, in your statement there, you have kind of, now I'm kind of short of English here, implying that sometimes we are not. But if you follow the traditional way of thinking and the traditional or the Indigenous values and culture, you shouldn't be overspending the resource and so on. So that is the living sentence that we share and teach. So, and also the CBD have several times, Convention on Biological Diversity have several times that claimed or had said or have facts showing that the most biodiverse regions of the world are areas that Indigenous peoples are managing. So if you want to protect biodiversity, you should also protect the Indigenous cultures. And that goes also for the Arctic. And it is an ethical question, which is also what you started with. But I think the ethical question is that if you are claiming in the capitals that you need to protect the Arctic biodiversity, and at the same time you dump mine tailings in the fjords, and you plan to make an Arctic railway that will go through what people would call untouched land, but which is reindeer pastures and hunting lands and swamps and berries, which is a great, will have great impact on the lands there. So can you at the same time sit and say you want to, oh, we need to protect the Arctic, it's so pristine and vulnerable, and at the same time make a decision that you have the need for economic development and at the same time ruin these lands? So I think that is the ethical question. But until yesterday, I thought I understood what mainstreaming means. I think it means to speak in a language that people understand. And I have a colleague of mine sitting in this room who have been explaining this to me many times, with my mom as an example. She wouldn't understand what the word biodiversity means, but she will perfectly well know how to utilize it. So also, and another story, I had to, on the way here, I had a 7 hours drive, and a journalist happened to call me just when I was nearby the radio studio, and he invited me to come and give an interview to try to explain where I was going and what this conference was about. So maybe the challenge for CAF next time is to find a title that people would understand.
That's for you, Tom. The floor is open. We have traveling microphones. Please raise your hand, and when you get a microphone, if you'd be kind enough to identify yourself and then ask a question, and rather to one of the panelists than all four of them, simply to maximize our time here. Please, you were first, and there is a microphone right there. Can we have it in here, please? Yeah, and when you raise your hand, raise it again when the people with the microphone is near to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Linda Shaw. I'm with the National Marine Fisheries Service in Juneau, Alaska.
It's a big city.
It's a big city.
Well, everything's relative, right? My question, I guess, is for all of the panelists.
No, that's illegal.
Oh, it was inspired by, my question was inspired by Tasha, so maybe I'll...
Thank you.
Yes, and I appreciated your comment about finding solutions. And also in listening to you speak, I was thinking about scales of solutions, in that the climate change is, it's driven by these huge global forces, maybe even the sun, you know, that are so beyond our control. So that when you talk about the local response, is that local response limited to simply adapting to these forces, or, you know, are we able on a local scale to respond to the global forces, or does the local scale, is the local scale able to influence a collective global reaction to a global problem? I hope
Thank
that
you
makes
very
sense.
much. The question is already good. Don't ruin it. Please, Tasha.
Sure. That is, it's hard. So a little fun fact about me is that I actually started out as a grassroots activist back home. I got involved in politics and in issues like these because I was seeing these issues locally. I was connecting with people across the state, and hearing about all of these problems, I wanted to take action on a global level. But in that experience, I started to realize that it is very hard to do that, especially as young people, you're not given the position often. Like, the fact that I'm on this panel right now is very rare. Oftentimes, young people are just asked to be the complement, you know, the person who is providing this personal story to the issues, not the ones engineering solutions, which is why I'm so proud of the people who attended the Arctic Youth Summit this week, because we were fixing things, we were thinking about solutions like the problem about the knowledge gap. We were thinking about, why don't we have a communication strategy to talk more about Arctic issues? But that's getting to another point, and I invite everyone to attend a workshop that all of our youth are hosting on Thursday if you want to learn more about that, and we will be presenting a declaration as well. But anyway, because of my experience working as a grassroots activist and learning about community organizing, I did notice that problem of that we want to often impact so much change on a global level, but sometimes it just isn't possible. And so it's more powerful to influence your energy, use your energy locally. And I think that requires a partnership between the global, the federal, the state, and the local levels, so that all of that knowledge is streamlined at a local level. Because we were talking a lot earlier about knowledge gaps, and I think what often happens is that common people don't know what the problems are. All they know is that for some reason in Shishmaref, there are orcas coming. And for some reason, the whaling hunt you can't pursue that because there is less Arctic ice. And that a lot of that knowledge isn't really shown, and we also don't know what's happening on the state level. We don't know what's happening on a federal level because there isn't formal invites, especially to young people and to just people just working in their communities. So there's a lot of frustration at that. And so I think a lot of it has to do with increasing transparency and making sure that there are more open invitations to people at a community level so that they know that so that we know that we can be impacting change, so that we know that we're able to have influence at a larger level, should we so choose to. And I think if that partnership exists, then it becomes a lot easier to make the transition to adapting and to other things a lot easier to facilitate.
I told you it was a good question. And thank you, Tasha, for bringing that up with the necessity of that type of partnerships. And luckily, we have the Arctic environmental ministers here, so we can actually bring it to them on Thursday. So thanks very much. Gunbritt, you wanted a word. Yes. Let's keep it short now, because there's a lot of people who want to add to our conversation here.
Yes, I actually had prepared a short answer. Not so much to the local thing, but I think somebody mentioned earlier too, I think the Arctic Council and the Arctic Cooperation can serve at least as a regional cooperation and serve as a model for the globe on how you can make decisions or recommendations, at least at the regional level. But the question is only that to get the Arctic member states to implement all the brilliant recommendations made by the Arctic Council.
Yeah. Please.
I'm Nadia Steiner from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I was a lead author on the AMAP report on Arctic ocean acidification. When we put that report together, and I'm kind of touching on the gap issue that was discussed before, the biggest gap that we actually ran into was the link between the changes in the environment to the species response. So, how do the species actually respond to all these multiple stressors in the environment? And I think part of that is because they experience changes that we have never seen, so we couldn't observe anything of that yet. But also because a lot of the research that we are doing right now is still a little bit in the subcategories, that we have all this monitoring that's starting, but it's very species-oriented. We have the climate modeling, which is very environmental conditions-oriented. And how do we link this and make sure that we use all the tools, that we monitor environmental conditions with the species, changes in species, and with what the indigenous people see in their subsistent harvest responses? How do we make sure that we have all these tools, that we combine them and then help us to assess how potential future changes might impact that? So essentially, how does Vladimir and Mike and Gunbritt talk better to each other so we can link all that components?
I'll leave that for Mike, but before thank you, already have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Well, there's maybe lots of reasons or solutions to that, but maybe the best one's funding, right? There's, funding typically is stovepiped, and we react to that, and we're also maybe lazy, so you stay within your comfort zone. But there's lots of good examples lately where funding mechanisms have become more cross-cutting, and they forced people like Vladimir and I to actually talk to each other and things like that. So that to me is a shortcut to forcing that sort of cross-cutting collaboration. And the other one is that we need to not forget that sort of intensive, extensive approach. The CBMP is doing that in terms of recognizing sort of super sites or places like Zackenberg where they're integrating research across taxa and food chains and linking that to climate. And then we have more extensive measures going out. So I think there's some great initiatives underway where you've got smart people that recognize exactly what you said, that we need to cross-collaborate. But funding's the best way.
And it's the gentleman here on the third row.
Hello, and thanks for a very interesting discussion. I'm Stig Johansson from Parks and Wildlife in Finland. And this is probably to Mike because you brought up this mainstreaming issue. And mainstreaming is, of course, is a real great deal, and I really agree to that because the main drivers to biodiversity loss comes from outside our own sector. Yet the discussion is very much within our own sector. Of course, I know mining is here this week, but generally the mainstreaming discussions tends to be amongst ourselves. So how do you think we should advance to engage these sectors like energy and mining in these discussions and take actions? And is there a win for the sectors to engage?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't ever call myself an expert on mainstreaming, but from the little bit that I've been involved, I think business and industry is quite interested and receptive to this, to a certain point anyways. But governments are the ones, and when I say governments, that could be a local government or subnational, national, or even regional, that in the end make the policies and decisions. So mainstreaming to me is not about like having some end-all be-all product or tool that solves all your issues. It's really about understanding the decision-making process and where in the points things break down in terms of the use and understanding of biodiversity knowledge. And I think the best approaches that I've seen are where you actually work, you do that sort of political economy analysis with governments at different scales to understand sort of where along that decision point that the transport ministry makes, could have they used biodiversity information, but they didn't, and why, and how do we sort of solve that problem? I don't know if that really answers it, but.
And if there is anybody here from the mining industry, you feel very welcome to join the conversation here, or any other parts of the business community that would like to join this particular discussion of mainstreaming. I think that would be a wonderful contribution. But otherwise, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I am Alexander Sokolov from Russia. I would like to try to ask my short question. First, do you aware or do you agree with the fact that, in general, the dialogue between the wide representatives of researchers and the real local people, but not their representatives, who of course doing the great job, but among the real local people, is poor? And if you agree with that, what would be your solution? And I would provide my solution. Do you agree with one of the solutions to make it obligatory for the white researcher representatives to live at least 2 months with the local people yearly? Thank you.
Yeah. Now, the traditional way of doing this would be to give the floor to Gunbritt Retta, and she would agree with you that this is a good idea. So I'm not going to do that. I will go to the science and say, would this provide any help?
You mean living
if
in the environment?
Yeah, I think the suggestion here really is that decision makers, and here we talk politicians in general, or no?
Scientists.
Researchers.
Researchers, okay, yes. Mr. Katsov, would that help?
Well, not in all cases. I believe that, for example, in some cases it would be not practical for some parts of, because the science is big. And if you're doing climate modeling, probably it will cause you additional problems and troubles if you are doing it from some place where these climate change problems are experienced, just for technical reasons. On the other hand, I should say that I observe some instruments which may bring us closer to what you are suggesting. And for example, it's a national experience. Russian National Science Foundation is running some or supporting some projects with moving the lead author, the lead researcher, to the place where he performs the study. I know such examples with regard to climate, to Russian part of the Arctic and permafrost, and the person who is enjoying living in beautiful city, St. Petersburg, he has to leave for half a year at least per year to stay there in another beautiful city of Yakutsk and environments, and to perform his research with some of his group over there. And I think it works, and even for a great satisfaction of the researcher himself, because he really finds a lot of inspirations in the region. So I think that it's not kind of obligatory for everyone, but it's an important instrument which in some case cleverly can be used and be very useful.
Right?
Yes, I can give it depends what kind of research that is, of course. Maybe satellite and monitoring is in some cases the best, but the difference between indigenous peoples and local peoples that live in the area, we are there all year round. So in some cases it depends on 2 months is enough, or 2 years is more sufficient. Correct. But at some point, I'm sure that scientist, when he comes back to his colleagues, they would say he's biased because he stayed there too long.
I believe there's a question. Yes, please.
Yes, my name's Skip Walker. I'm from Alaska, and one of the big things we started to get at it when we started talking about the mining industry here, but I'm just wondering how many people here are representing industry and the infrastructure that is being developed in the Arctic that is probably having a more immediate effect on biodiversity than anything else. Could we just see the hands of how many people here are representing some form of infrastructure or industry in any way?
There's a small number.
Okay.
Don't worry.
There's more than I thought. And,
yeah, they're here.
Yeah. So that's actually good. And I think we've in the past had a very low representation, and it would be really good if we could emphasize the communication between industry and this group and climate researchers and myself. I'm trying to look at the bridge between climate change and infrastructure and how that's affecting biodiversity and the landscapes that we see in the Arctic, and issues like fragmentation, which are being caused by pipelines and roads, and but also the climatological effects of industrial pollution, and that's all happening on a big scale. And I don't think we really realize, because it's not happening in the villages, it's happening away from the villages. So how do we engage industry in a more effective way than we've been doing?
Thank you very much. And now, those of you who just had your hand up, now that you raised your hand anyway, is there any of you who would like to offer a response? Yes, there was one.
Thank you. My name is David Schönberg Alm. I'm the Swedish CAF board representative, and I am also co-leading, together with Canada, a project or an initiative within the CAF about mainstreaming biodiversity. And in this project, we've chosen to engage with the mining industry. So I just want to highlight that this is actually something that we are trying to do already. We've had a first roundtable discussion with the mining representatives from the North America, and we will continue this work. It's an ongoing project, and it's going really well so far. We've had some productive discussions. So just to let you know that this is actually sort of already ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anybody else on this particular topic? Yes, you had your hand up before, please. Right in there in the middle.
Very much in the middle.
Yeah, we need drones for these microphones. Here we go.
Okay, hello. Well, I'm Nora Ahola, and I'm representing mining industry and exploration. So, yeah, I'm glad I'm not alone here. There are a few others, I know. But yeah, I think it's important that we are also here. My position is environmental director, and my duty is to take care of the environment. Even if we are doing research, geological research, and maybe mining at some point, but I think it would be good to involve industry more, because if you are just, if it's only the biodiversity people and people who aim to protect nature and not anybody else, you won't get the word out and nothing happens. It's not always so easy, and you don't always feel so welcomed if you go to events where you are, how to say it, on the other side. But I feel welcomed here, and I'm really much waiting for these panels and presentations. So, yeah. That's it for now.
Thank you very much for your intervention here, and I hope you will take the opportunity later on also to grab a microphone. There's one behind you, but first it's the lady right here in front of me.
But my question was not about mining.
No, go ahead, because we are wrapping up now. I'll
Okay.
just allow a couple of questions, and then we'll take a final round. Yes.
Can I say a couple of words about this interaction issue?
Please, go ahead.
Just
hold.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think, as I probably already tried to say, that I think that this adaptation effort, which is very nicely visible in the international negotiation process and in Paris Agreement, is making a very nice environment context for the dialogue, for a dialogue between industries and science. And I really put a lot of hope to this. I understand that without this dialogue, of course, industries may create something like their adaptation plans, but I should warn that zillions of whatever can be wasted without science. And I don't think that everyone who is involved in this now recognizes this. And I use every opportunity to say this whenever it is possible. I think that dialogue is really important here. And of course, it's not that all questions can be responded by science at the point. But indeed, we can, through this dialogue, can bring the industries to much better solutions with regard to their proactive or current adaptation to climate change. So I would really, how to say it, I would really look with quite some optimism and regard as an effort deserving a lot of attention to creating this dialogue. It sounds really trivial, but I know what is lacking now. Science really has to demonstrate what it can do for concrete industries in concrete cases, and I think science is able now to provide something. I stop at this point, but
Thank you.
I could continue.
Yeah. Important. I'll take one or two more, so please keep them brief. We are running out of time, please.
Okay, I will have it brief. It's actually quite brief. I am Dorothy Erich from the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. And my question is, first of all, to Gunn-Britt. Yesterday, I was at a meeting where we were discussing a report of the terrestrial group of the Circumpolar Biodiversity Report. And as in many other reports, I was involved in the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment as well. We discussed the fact that it is difficult to involve traditional knowledge, that it is difficult to include it, and that it is underrepresented. And then an idea came up. It was actually said by Christine Quiller, working in Greenland, that maybe there should be a separate working group for traditional knowledge, which would provide or which would integrate, quality assure, and make available the monitoring data from the traditional knowledge. So my question to you is, would you think this is a good idea, or would you think that we as Western scientists are putting you apart, which is absolutely not the meaning?
Thank you. We'll save that for a minute or two while there was somebody right there. Yes, please.
Thank you. No, just a quick advertising punch of Warwick Mostert from Anglo American. So we want to be part of the process. After lunch, there's a session that I'm chairing and hope to see you there. Maybe we can answer some of the questions.
Right, and kick-started the dialogue that Vladimir was just talking about. Thank you very much for that invitation. Any final remarks, questions, inputs? There is one in the back there, and then I will ask the panel to include answers in your final remarks.
Thank you so much. My name is Marianne Kroglund. I work with AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. I think the debate has been excellent. We have talked a lot about dialogue, about resilience and adaptation, but we shouldn't forget the need to mitigate emissions, and that we need deep cuts in the near future to avoid implications on biodiversity and so forth. So we also need to remember that part of the story, and I guess there will be a lot of presentations coming the next days that will look into this and hear the dialogue with the sectors and the industries are also important, so that we make sure that we work on low emission pathways, that we work on energy efficiency and so forth. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that important reminder. That was also, of course, presented by the IPCC on Sunday, that some very, very, very unprecedented action, I think the word was, is needed. So there was a concrete question for you, Gunbrid, and there was a reminder and an invitation. So please, I'll ask you all to make a final remark if you have any, and perhaps incorporate some of the latest messages here from the audience. Gunbrid, there was a concrete one for you, so I'll ask you to start.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's a very good question, if it's could have a separate group. I think our Sami Council primary kind of position when Arctic Council is making reports and assessments and so on is to have co-production, so Indigenous and other knowledge holders and scientists can fully work together. But I also recognize, which I was saying earlier, that we have capacity challenges. So kind of I don't know if I should call it the fallback position, could be to have a separate look at Indigenous knowledge and have a separate group that could contribute while we are building the capacity. So depending on exactly what work it was, I think it's a part of the discussion. If in some cases that will be the most efficient while we are building the capacity. And I mentioned, and you mentioned earlier, which is part of my concluding remark, is co-production of knowledge. And CAF is actually where we try to turn it around, that not only the scientists knows the gaps or knows what to do research on, but we are trying with a Salmon Peoples project in the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group to gather the knowledge holders. And this is about 3 big rivers in the Arctic, from Sami region, from Alaska, and a river from Russia, to gather the knowledge holders first, to talk about what they see as challenges in their rivers and their fishing. And then, secondly, identify what would be the science question to help address these challenges that the knowledge holders have seen and observed of changes or so on. But I also, and a very final thing, I think, to understand the Arctic, you also have to understand the people. And the title of this is Biodiversity Conservation, but I think we have to go beyond the conversation about the conservation. So, which I'm struggling with those 2 words when I write. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Vladimir, do you have a final word for us?
Maybe just to summarize, and I try to do it very briefly. First of all, I think that the very dialogue like we have now is a very important step towards 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 dealing with climate change at the level we need now. It's not probably, I mean, with regard to, for example, for adaptation, it's not that global at the moment. It goes down to the regions and the local places and everything, and we really need to make the luxury of scientific results useful for practical use. And it is through such kind of dialogues it may be achievable. I think the issue of language between communities, finding best ways to interpret, by the way, to understand ourselves, because it's not that we are perfectly ready with giving some recommendations for many practical issues, and we are not so perfectly equipped with our models to respond to many questions which are very urgent for many local problems. So I think this is a good opportunity to do this now and in similar on similar occasions, and I'm really happy to be here and to listen and to try to speak something. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mike Gill.
Well, there's obviously a lot of things we didn't cover. We didn't talk about invasives. We didn't talk about things like the Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative, which is a great example of CAF kind of taking it on the road and addressing some of those drivers for migratory birds. So it's hard to kind of sum up what everything could be accomplished or focused on, but I think one major theme that came out of this panel is the focus on localizing the science and through partnerships and focusing on science and cultural-based adaptation and resilience. That's probably one key thing that think we need to move towards, to be a little bit more proactive.
Could I ask you, from your your vantage point within the international community that you now work, is there a tendency, and I'm asking because of the last reminder we were given by the lady from AMAP, is there a tendency now to focus on adaptation because it's more manageable than talking of mitigation?
Well, no, I wouldn't say so. I think it just depends on where the appropriate discussion is for mitigation. Obviously, there's been a lot of leadership, especially from Indigenous peoples, in terms of getting the message out around mitigation. But I'm not sure in this room that's the right focus. I'm not saying that mitigation isn't obviously the best adaptation approach you can take, but we have to be realistic. And we're talking about Arctic biodiversity conservation, including peoples and human health and well-being. So what are the actions we can take around that while still getting that message out around mitigation? But the mitigation actions really have to come from other areas.
Thank you for providing that perspective as well. And we will finalize where we started with our very humble Arctic ambassador. And I know you will probably also be back later on this week. There is a presentation by the Arctic ambassadors. But for now, Tasha, tell us what's on your mind.
Right, so I actually have to correct that part. We have a presentation on Thursday for the Arctic Youth Summit attendees, which is separate from the Arctic Youth Ambassadors. The ambassador program is comprised of just 12 of Alaskans, and then we also have the summit, which is Arctic youth from all nations, as well as from observer nations too. So really strongly encourage people to come by. We also have an Arctic Youth Ambassador and someone from Sweden who is also going to be presenting, both youth, later today, talking about their own experiences growing up as Arctic youth later in the afternoon. So I also encourage people to come out and learn from their stories as well. But I think that we talked about a variety of different things, and I think that one of our focuses was the knowledge gaps that exist when it comes to how we want to adapt to climate change. And I do really want to thank the person who brought up the idea of mitigation, because I think that's something that in Alaska, our state government is working with heavily on, too, and I think should be a larger part of the discussion when we're talking about different things that we should be doing in approach to climate change. But I also want to stress again that, I mean, I'm 19 years old, we're talking about all these different things. I know that there are scientists, decision makers, and industry representatives, and a lot of other people in this room right now who are in these positions of power where we can influence change. And while I like to say that, you know, as a young person, I was talking earlier about how we brought together all these Arctic youth to implement and create and ideate these solutions to help the Arctic, because we all have so many concerns about it. We can come up with all these ideas, but we need to have the partnership. We need to have a relationship between the people who do have power and the people who unfortunately aren't given as much power to make those changes. And frankly, I'm 19, a lot of the people in the Arctic Youth Summit group are between 18 to, I think 28 might be the oldest. But we're all going to be living with all of the consequences that we choose to make now. And so if we want to see change, and if I want to be able to live with a healthy conscience and know that my kids in the future will be able to live the way I'm living now and appreciate what I get to appreciate in Alaska, we need to be making the right decisions.
Thank you, Tasha. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation, and please help me say thank you to a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Thank you for your contributions, all four of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's great. Yes, thank you. So.